Hi, this lecture is going to present the first two steps in the process of self-cultivation that are presented in the text, The Great Learning, and it's presenting them through the interpretation offered by Zhu Xi. Before getting to those two steps, it's helpful to get an overview on The Great Learning as a whole and what it presupposes. So Zhu says that there are various prerequisites before you can engage in this higher type of learning. So just as we have higher education and elementary education, so too in Neo-Confucian philosophy, there's the great learning or the greater learning and also a lesser learning. So in other texts, Zhu will say that the lesser learning consists in studying how to carry out affairs, but without knowing what you're doing. So this will involve learning how to do various things like archery, like reading, like proper ways to engage in various social contexts. And so the lesser learning basically gives you what to do, that what a proper person will do, but without that person understanding what they're doing, and particularly understanding why they're doing what they're doing, why that is the best way to do things. Now, a second prerequisite that's not emphasized nearly as much is something like settling the mind or having a tranquil mind. And so the basic idea here is that you need to be able to engage in a focused, attentive way to what's prescribed by the Great Learning, so that you genuinely appreciate the lessons that you learn. And one way to do this is to practice quiet sitting, so something like meditation. Now, once you have those two prerequisites, then it's suitable for you to engage in the greater learning. And what you'll do is study the principles that underlie the activities that are prescribed by the lesser learning. So studying the principles that explain proper behavior in social contexts and proper behavior to be a genuinely virtuous, exemplary person. And if you achieve what the Great Learning prescribes, then you will have cultivated yourself. But you also do more than cultivate yourself. That's just the beginning of a greater process that extends beyond oneself. So one way we can understand the Great Learning is that it's divided up into 8 different steps, and we'll focus on the first 5, which culminate in self-cultivation. And we're going to go through those in this lecture and the next 2 lectures. But there's 3 more steps, which are regulating families, putting the state in order, and then setting the world at peace. So notice that you begin by focusing on yourself, and then the process extends to a larger group of people, the family, then it extends to a larger group of people, the state, and then to the largest group of people, the world as a whole. And so notice the implicit view here. For the world to be better, it needs to start with individuals being better, being self-cultivated. So that's one way the Great Learning can be divided up. An alternative way is through what can be called the 3 guidelines. So the process of self-cultivation is to culminate in the first guideline, which is to enlighten one's enlightened virtue. And what that phrase means is essentially that you have innate knowledge within you, but it needs to be enlightened. It needs to have a light shone upon it so that it shines forth itself more brightly, so that you actually act on that innate knowledge of what's morally good. So that's the first thing that's accomplished through the first 5 steps, which is identical to self-cultivation. The second guideline is renewing the people, renewing people's social relationships, making them healthy in the family and in the state. And then the final guideline is to rest in the ultimate good for everything to be set on the path or the way. as I've noted, we're only going to focus on the first 5 steps. And so let's get into it right now. Now, the first step is getting a handle on things. This step is really tricky, as we'll see, because the notion that's at work here in Chinese can be interpreted in a variety of ways, not just translated in a variety of ways, interpreted by the Neo-Confucian thinkers themselves. And so here's where what Zhu Xi says comes into play. So Zhu clarifies what this means, getting a handle on things, by saying that it involves studying pattern. So recall from the previous lecture, pattern is one of the 2 metaphysical components that make up everything. So pattern is what ultimately explains the structure of everything that exists. And so what we're supposed to do with this first step is engage in an investigation of the general structures of things, the general structures of proper behavior, as well as things in the world. It's important to emphasize that on Zhu's interpretation, this is very intellectual. So the idea here is that you need to have genuine knowledge and bring out your innate knowledge, because spontaneous action could lead you astray. So you need to have this intellectual knowledge of what is proper to do so that you can apply that knowledge in any given situation to the particulars of that situation. It might be helpful to clarify what Zhu has in mind here by saying how he contrasts with Plato. So recall that on Plato's view, or Socrates' view, we need definitions of things. We need definition of virtue, a definition of justice, and so on, in order to engage in moral or virtuous behavior. And a definition is something that you can express in a single sentence, something like a general principle that you can apply in any given situation. So if you have a definition of justice, you can take that definition, analyze a given situation to see whether a particular action in that situation would count as just or not. Now, that's not the approach that Zhu is recommending, and that's indicated by the word pattern. The basic idea here is that things are interconnected, and so the particulars of one situation are connected to a variety of other things out there in the world. So you might be engaging in a particular situation with one other person, but they're related to other people who are indirectly affected by whatever action you undertake. So there's something here like what some philosophers have called moral particularism. This is the idea that you cannot give general rules, general principles for moral behavior. Rather, you need to look at the particulars of any given situation. But what's distinctive with what Zhu Xi says is that not only do you look at the particulars of any given situation, you need to take a holistic approach. So you're not just narrowly focused on a particular situation, but you're considering how that situation is interrelated with other things. But when you consider how it's interrelated with other things, you're also not going to the other extreme of having a principle that is a universal truth that will apply to any given situation. So the idea here is that you can't have a universal principle, that's one extreme, and also that you cannot just narrowly focus on a particular situation, and that's the other extreme. Rather, we're doing something sort of in the middle. So what does this involve in practice, in the practice of the great learning and studying? Well, it's going to involve methods like reading books of the sages, as well as a bunch of histories in the Confucian tradition, in order to look at various situations, particular circumstances, to see how sages acted in those circumstances and what they said about those circumstances, to get a sense of what morality or virtue requires. And then, of course, you'll reflect on the virtues themselves, reflect on what benevolence is, reflect on what ritual propriety is, and you'll read what Confucius had to say about it and so on. Now, you're not going to go with that to figure out a definition of benevolence, but you'll nevertheless get a proper appreciation or a full appreciation of benevolence. An example here might help. So in the Analects, Confucius is depicted or says a lot of things that are sometimes seem in tension, particularly with truth-telling. So he generally seems to have the idea that honesty is the best policy, or that truth-telling is the right sort of behavior in most circumstances. But there are notable circumstances in which Confucius engaged in deceptive behavior. Now, for this first step of great learning, what you're supposed to do is read about all these various instances of what Confucius did or said and reflect on them to try to better understand what truth-telling, the virtue of truth-telling, demands, and when you might engage in deceptive behavior. And what you'll do is analyze the differences between different situations that might explain why truth-telling in one situation is good and why in another situation being deceptive might be warranted. Now, once you've engaged in the study of pattern or principle in the various books that you've read, the second step is to extend that knowledge. To understand this second step, we need to recall some background from the philosopher Mengzi. Mengzi held that human nature is good. And part of what that means is that we have innate moral knowledge. In particular, we have 4 so-called moral sprouts, 4 types of feelings or ways of reacting to things in the world that are morally good ways of reacting, but only the most undeveloped morally good ways. So we have the feeling of compassion in certain circumstances, that we have a concern for others' well-being. We have the feeling of disdain or shame for improper action. We have the feeling of respect for ourselves and for others. And then finally, this reaction of approving or disapproving of various courses of action. And so we automatically or spontaneously will have these feelings or reactions in a variety of circumstances, but we don't always. So that's why they need to be developed or cultivated. So we develop or cultivate these innate automatic reactions to become full-fledged virtues, such as benevolence, righteousness, ritual propriety, and wisdom. Now, the thing to emphasize here is that we have innate moral knowledge, and we can recognize this innate moral knowledge in ourselves by paying attention to our reactions, to our feelings in various situations. So this leads us to the second step, which is to extend knowledge. In particular, the knowledge that we're supposed to extend is that innate knowledge that Mengzi had described. So the Great Learning says, to extend one's knowledge is to desire that one has completely fathomed what one knows. Zhu clarifies this step by saying that, quote, to extend one's knowledge is to desire that one has completely fathomed what one knows, end quote. So notice the language there, that one already knows something. So what one knows, that phrase indicates innate knowledge, but what you're supposed to do is completely fathom it. So you're supposed to plumb the depths of this knowledge, go within inside of yourself to the deepest level to get that knowledge. But notice this other word he uses, desire. You're supposed to desire to completely fathom this knowledge. I think the idea there is that this is a constant process. You need to have this genuine desire that you constantly act on to try to bring out this innate knowledge. So how are we supposed to do that? Well, it's through a variety of methods, I think. So one would be to emulate the sages. So you have those innate moral reactions, and you'll want to do various things that the sages did to activate those innate moral reactions, because what you ultimately want to do is have those innately good reactions become settled dispositions, habits for acting well or acting virtuously. So doing the things that the sages did might help you here. Now, there are other ways to develop or cultivate those innate moral reactions. One is to consider how others are similar to oneself, or use something like sympathetic understanding of others. So the basic idea here is that the primary Confucian virtue of benevolence concerns our relations with other people. And we sometimes don't have that virtue because we're too focused on ourselves. We don't really think in the perspective of another person. And if we were to think from their perspective, we would actually have those automatic reactions that the moral sprouts involve. So we just need to engage in something like sympathetic understanding, trying to imagine what sorts of feelings other people have and to share those feelings in order to activate those innate moral reactions. Another method here would be to practice extending naturally good actions. So in Mengzi's view, we have these automatic reactions which are good, but we don't always have an opportunity to be in a situation where those feelings are activated. So we're supposed to put ourselves in situations, go out of our way to put ourselves in those situations to activate those feelings. Now, one final method here is to engage in reflection on one's good behavior as well as one's bad behavior. But particularly, you reflect on good behavior and reflect on that feeling of compassion and take joy in having that feeling. And so what Mengzi says is that in taking joy in the very good reaction itself, you nourish the moral sprout. And then you learn to take joy in other sorts of moral behavior that might be morally difficult. So you take joy in sort of the easy situations where it's easy to be moral, and then you'll ultimately find it enjoyable or beneficial to engage in the more difficult circumstances to engage in moral behavior. To conclude this lecture, I want to emphasize that these first two steps are inseparable in a way. So at one point, it's described that the first two steps, both together, are an exhaustive investigation of pattern. And it's easy to see why these first two steps go together. With the first step, you have this intellectual knowledge of pattern or principle. And with the second step, you actually manifest that pattern or principle in yourself. And so you acquire a deeper understanding of pattern or principle by putting it into action in your own life. But likewise, if you go back and read those Confucian texts after you've put it into practice in your own life, you'll probably understand some of what Confucius says a little bit better. So these two steps go together and they feed off of each other. But of course, that's not the completion of the task of self-cultivation. In the next lecture, we'll pick up with steps 3 and 4.